followed someone on Facebook, and you saw they had a post that was from North Carolina, and then they had a post from Knoxville, Tennessee, and then they had a post from Denver, and then they had a post from Salt Lake City. What would you conclude? Okay, they're traveling, they're getting around. What else would you conclude by that? They're going west, maybe running away, I don't know. Probably they're coming home, right? They're on their way. There's a direction to what they're doing. It's not just random cities that they decide they're going to go to. Well, that's what's happening in this middle section of the Gospel of Mark. This isn't a list of the places that Jesus happens to stop by. This is a journey of consequence. Each step, each stop is one step closer to the cross and ultimately to the resurrection. Jesus teaches his disciples with words and directions. So to be able to fully understand today's scripture, we need to examine the lead-in, examine the journey. So a few weeks ago, you may remember we sort of dropped into the Gospel of Mark. We dropped in at the 7th chapter, the 24th verse. Jesus was going north into Tyre, outside of Israel. He was going there to hide. He was going there to escape. But it didn't work. He thought, well, nobody's going to know me here. But this Gentile woman came and accosted him, wanted something from him. You know, he's been tired. Everybody wanted something from him, so he's trying to get away. And it didn't work. But this was a significant time because this was the first time the Gentiles were offered God's love. It was a foretaste of what would come. Well, then we move to the 8th chapter. Jesus and the disciples travel through Caesarea Philippi. They're surrounded by temples and by objects of worship for all kinds of gods, monuments. Everywhere they looked, another god was being honored. And this is where Jesus chose to ask those two questions. What were those two questions? Wasn't that long ago.
Who do the people say I am?
Who do you say I am? And who do others say that I am? Perfect place to ask that question, surrounded by so much. Then he begins to speak to them about the cross. This is the first time in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus starts to talk to them about the cross and heading toward the cross. And that's where this journey is going. That's where the journey is going. And you remember as Jesus talked about the cross and all that it meant, Peter pulled him aside, said, no, you're not going to die. We got your back. We'll fight for you. No problem. God will win. Because we know God's on your side. Jesus rebuked him and said, Peter, you heard the words, but you don't get it. You don't get it. So then, 6 days later, and this we don't have in the lectionary, this will come up on Transfiguration Sunday, but what happens is after he's first talked about the cross, then the Transfiguration happens. Jesus gives them a quick glimpse of what the resurrected Jesus will be like. And then today, following that, we find Jesus sneaking through Galilee so that he can talk to the disciples and won't be distracted. He can focus on them. And he tells them a second time about the cross. And they don't get it. They don't understand, but they don't say anything about it. They don't say anything about it because, when Peter said something, man, he got chewed out. So they may not understand, but they're not going there. It's like I was trying to remember, a show that I always watch is Project Runway. I couldn't remember the name of that in the first service. But it has a bunch of people who are designers, and they compete each week. And if they're in the very bottom, they get tossed until there's one left. And so Tim Gunn, who is a designer, was talking to one of the would-be designers about how the dress could be done better. And he used some word for some technique that I never heard of. And the person that he was talking to was self-taught. And so she didn't have a clue about what he was talking, but she smiled and nodded her head, and then they do those little things in the background of, they reflect on that, and she said, I didn't have any idea at all what he was talking about, but I wasn't going to say anything. That's kind of what the disciples were. We don't get it, but I'm just not going to say anything. So that's the picture that we have here. So the first time Peter is corrected, the second time they don't say anything. As they're on this road to Capernaum, after hearing what Jesus said about the cross and what it meant, they were arguing among themselves about who's the best. Who's the number one disciple? Kind of reminds me of the debate. Did you watch the debate this week? The most used phrase was, "I'm the only one on the stage who," and then fill in the blank. I mean, and that makes sense because they're trying to distinguish themselves from others. But we do that all the time. We want to be just a little above everybody else, if only just a step. We want to be above everybody else. Jesus tells them, however, this is what it takes to follow me, to be the best. There's a cost, but they didn't get it. So here in the 9th chapter, Jesus tries to get the disciples to understand the journey they must walk. He's trying to get them to see the seriousness of the cross. It's serious. It's not just something we wear, we go play or whatever. There's something serious about that. Soren Kierkegaard said that most people believe that Christian commandments like love your neighbor as yourself are intentionally a little too severe. Like setting the clock half an hour ahead to make sure we won't be late in the morning. Now, that's kind of cute, but we do that in a lot of ways. Okay, yeah, Jesus said to do this, but that's really hard, and I think he was just doing it to make a point. I don't really have to do that. Jesus took them aside, talked to them about the seriousness of the cross. For many years, Anton Lang played Christ in the Passion play. One day a friend was visiting him on the set and saw the cross that was used in the play, and so he thought, well, I'll see what this is like. And he was assuming that it was a hollowed-out cross, because it's used every night and every night. And as he tried to pick it up, it was heavy. It was heavy. It was made out of solid wood. And he asked Lang, why is it so heavy? Why don't you just make one that looks like a cross? And Lang answered, if I do not feel the weight of his cross, I cannot play his part. He recognized the seriousness that Jesus was talking about. We often don't get the seriousness or the cost. I'm reminded every once in a while you'll see on the internet or something of someone who wants to show their faith by taking a cross, dressing like Jesus, taking a cross, putting it on their shoulder and walking across the city or the state or whatever they happen to do, which looks really impressive until you look at where the cross hits the ground. They've attached a wheel on it. It's like, it's all or nothing. Why? If you're going to do it right. That's kind of what Jesus is saying. There's a cost. You have to bear the whole cross. It's all or nothing. If in your life of faith, the question is, how often do you reflect on the seriousness of your faith? We reflect real good when we're in trouble. But how often in your normal, everyday life do you reflect on the seriousness of the call? Walt Disney was said to be a ruthless film editor. Whenever something didn't further the story along, no matter how good it was, it might even be amazing, if it didn't further along the story, he tossed it. Ward Kimball was one of the animators of Snow White, and he spent 8.5 months on a 4.5-minute segment in which the dwarves made soup for Snow White. It was brilliant. It was funny. Walt loved it. But it didn't further along the story, and so he cut it. 8.5 months. He understood the seriousness of things. What might we need to eliminate from our lives because it hinders our living fully in God? What is it that comes up in our lives that might hinder us from God? What do we need to say? This is not furthering my faith story. Professor Maury Schwartz was dying from ALS. Mitch Albom was a sports writer for the Detroit Free Press, and Schwartz was one of his professors. As he was dying, he went every Tuesday to visit with Maury, and he wrote a book. It's a great book. I recommend it. Breakfast with Maury. Tuesdays with Maury. It's about the things he learned from this old professor in the weeks leading up to his death. He said on one of those visits, Maury said, take any emotion. Love for a woman or grief for a loved one or what I'm going through. Fear and pain from a deadly illness. If you hold back on the emotions, if you don't allow yourselves to go all the way through them, you can never get to being detached. You're too busy being afraid. You're afraid of the pain, you're afraid of the grief, you're afraid of the vulnerability that loving entails. But by throwing yourself into these emotions, by allowing yourself to dive in all the way, over your head even, you experience them fully and completely. You know what pain is, you know what love is, you know what grief is. And only then can you say, all right, I've experienced that emotion. I recognize that emotion. Now I need to detach from that emotion for a moment. I recognize that emotion. I need to detach. Maury stopped and looked over, perhaps to see if I was getting it right. And he said, I know you think this is just about dying. But it's like I keep telling you, when you learn how to die, you learn how to live. When you learn how to die, you learn how to live. That's part of what Jesus was teaching the disciples. To come to him is to come to the cross. You get it? Well, the disciples didn't. And there's a million reasons not to get it. There's a million reasons not to want to get it. Because it's hard. Because there's a cost. Dick Gregory, a black comedian and activist, was talking about taking his oldest son to Mexico, to a place that had no electricity, and they stayed in a little hut. On the first night, his son had gone out, and he came running in. He was yelling, Dad, Dad, come here, I'm scared. I want to show you something. And so Dick went out with his son. His son showed him the stars in the sky. He had never seen that many stars before. He was born in the city, in Chicago. Had never seen all those stars. They're blocked out by the light, by buildings, all kinds of things. You know how it is. It's a much different picture as you're riding up in the foothills. You see millions of stars. So Gregory said they both lay down, looked up into the sky, and they looked at the constellations, the Big Dipper, the Milky Way. They saw some shooting stars even. He said, I cried that night. Not for him. He had never seen that many stars before, but for me. And he said something very profound. He said, I grew up looking at the stars. I never remember the day they left. I never remember the day they left. Sometimes that's how it is in our lives of faith. We felt so close to God, and then day by day we get so involved in stuff and stuff and stuff. It gets further and further away. I never remember the day they left. When Jesus talks about the cost of discipleship, more often than not, we don't get it because we are like the disciples. We don't want to get it. We don't want to give up our own ways. We want our rightful place, which is just about everybody else. In his commentary on Mark, Paul Manier says, this section is the most important to Mark because it spells out the road ahead of Jesus. And then he says, on this very road to the Messiah's humiliation, disciples had been quarreling over places of honor. Nothing could stand in sharper contrast to Jesus' journey than their private ambitions. It is so easy to get distracted by our private ambitions and by any number of things. One day Abraham Lincoln was walking down the street with two of his sons who were crying and acting out toward each other. Someone said, well, what's the matter with the boys? Lincoln said, well, it's exactly what's wrong with the world. I have 3 walnuts and each boy wants 2. Isn't that how it is? You can have your part, but don't make it bigger than mine. Salvador Dali once said, at the age of 6, I wanted to be a cook. At 7, I wanted to be Napoleon. And my ambition has been growing steadily ever since. At least he's clear about it and can name it. It's easy to live for ourselves and not for Christ. When Albert Einstein was at Princeton in the 40s, he had the best office in the place. It's a wonderful office, a study, a parlor, even had its own small private garden. Now the other professors were a bit jealous, but it was Einstein. So if someone had to have it, I guess that was okay. But when he died in his sleep in 1955, they called all of the professors together and they let them know that he had died, and there was a gasp. And then from the back someone said, "So who gets his office?" Right? We are there so quick. What do you really want? What is it that keeps coming back to you that, oh, I gotta have that. Gotta have that. Sometimes we think we deserve things from God because, we've lived so faithfully or we've tried so hard that we're waiting for our paycheck. Well, there was a little first grader who hurried into the classroom and said, "Teacher, 2 boys are fighting on the playground, and I think the one on the bottom wants you." Isn't that how we live?
Oh, for sure.
When we're on the bottom, we can pray fervently. But when we're on the top, no problem, God, I got this covered. Do we only look to Christ when we're on the bottom? That's a question of your faith. Do you only look to Christ when you're on the bottom? Theologian Victor Havel defined hope and could define faith as well. Said it is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. Read that again, because I think it's important. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. I got a call on Friday from a couple who I married when I was over in Brentwood. They were in their 60s when they got married, and he called and said, my wife is very sick. Can you come and see her? Figured probably cancer was the name of that. But I went over there and found her. She was in a hospital bed. She had been diagnosed with cancer about 3 months before. And I thought, how does one pray in that situation? Does one pray expecting what you want, or expecting that God will be there no matter what? Can we pray in that second way? Thy will be done. Not mine, but yours. Jesus began letting the disciples know what this cross thing meant for them. It means putting yourself aside and serving others. Jesus is literally embodying the truth that greatness in God's kingdom comes through sacrifice when he lifted up that little child. He wasn't lifting up this cute little baby. It wasn't like when Comfort brings her grandbaby in and everyone wants to hold her. This was a child that was dirty, unattended, just hanging out, maybe even an orphan. And Jesus picked up this child and put it in the middle. He said, your call is to serve those who can't take care of themselves. Adoption in those days, there wasn't anything formal about it. If one were to pick up a child they found on the street who was orphaned, that was the sign that now that was a part of that new family. And so you see the imagery of Jesus picking up this child. I read somewhere, I don't remember exactly what it is, but when Mother Teresa was around and going strong, a group came to visit her and see what she was doing, and they were so impressed. And like you do when you see somebody, I wish I could be like you. And she said, you can. And so she picked up this dirty child who had been playing in the mud, held it and gave it a kiss, and then put it back down and waited for them. Did it. It's not easy to serve others. Irma Bombeck said, I used to spend time hiding the things I didn't want the kids to find. And then there was the additional time of trying to find them myself afterwards. We've all been there. She said, now if I want to hide something, I simply put it under the dish towel. In 28 years, no one has ever touched it besides me. You know, in my house, I would certainly touch it if I knew what our own ways, our own routine. We'd like others to take care of us. You heard about the Australian who got a new boomerang? Spent the rest of his life trying to throw away the old one. Do they have boomerangs in Fiji, by the way? No, okay. We get caught up in our old ways. You know, we do the things we've done over and over again, whether or not it works. We fail to terminate bad relationships. We replay patterns of dependence, self-absorption. We return over and over to harmful patterns in our life. We rely on old reactions because it's what we know. How do we keep going back to the old? And the disciples were in that old pattern of wanting to be highest. And they would go back there. How do we stop from doing that? Jesus calls us to serve. One reason is that often we don't see the pain and desperation in the people we meet. There are those around us who are dealing with all kinds of things in their lives. We don't see them. Sometimes we do. Mary Mitchell's got a big old boot on her foot. But she may have other things on her heart and mind. We don't know. Almost everyone you meet is dealing with something in their life. So when Jesus calls us to serve, we may be the only person who can meet that need. Jim Wallace, who was the founder of the Sojourners community in Washington, D.C., tells about being mugged right outside his own home. He said, they rushed me, knocked me to the ground, and then yelled, "Keep him down, get his wallet." He said, I popped up quickly, which seemed to surprise them. Seeing no weapons flashed, I squared to face my attackers. This was the first chance we really had to see each other face to face. I saw my assailants were just children. 3 about 15 and 1 little boy who couldn't have been more than 13. The boys backed up a little when they saw I was bigger than they expected. He said, I'm a strong believer in nonviolence, but I've learned that being a weightlifter often helps in the potential conflict situations like this. The one who had hit me moved into a boxing stance while the others circled. The little guy began attempting ineffectual karate kicks that he had probably seen on TV. He said, I decided to confront them, not intending to hurt them, but only to fend them off. Instinctively, he said, I began to scold these young, lost souls. I told them to stop it, to stop terrorizing people, to stop such violent behavior in our neighborhood. Finally, he said, I shouted at them, I'm a pastor. And I told them if they wanted to try and beat up and rob a pastor, they should come ahead and take their best shot. He said, I knew that invoking the authority of the church in the streets is hardly a sure thing these days, but our churches often have such little involvement there. Whatever it was that changed their minds, the youthful muggers turned and ran. And I yelled, get back here. And then I thought instantly, that's probably the wrong thing to do. The littlest kid, as they ran away, the littlest kid who had been no more than 4.5 feet tall, turned back and looked at me as he ran. With a sad face and voice, the young man said, Pastor, ask God for a blessing for me. The little one had tried so hard to be tough, yet he knew he needed a blessing. Everyone we need needs a blessing. Everyone we need needs a blessing. The question for us is, will we offer that blessing in Christ? The Spirit comes to us and gives us the strength and the power to live as those disciples, carrying a cross that is service to others. May we live